Picture this. You are Maelbright, a powerful warlord in northern Scotland. It is the year 890. You are waiting for a peace treaty with the Orkney Vikings. The terms are sacred. 40 men on 40 horses from each side to settle a border dispute. No armies, no tricks. You watch the horizon. The Viking leader, Sigurd the Mighty, appears. You count the horses. 1, 2, 40. Exactly 40. You signal your men to lower their weapons, but as they ride closer, the ground shakes too hard. You squint at the saddles and your blood runs cold. There are 2 sets of legs dangling from every horse. Sigurd has strapped a second warrior behind every rider. It isn't 40 men coming to talk. It is 80 heavy cavalry coming to kill. You scream betrayal, but the charge has already begun. In minutes, your 40 honour guards are hacked to pieces. You are dragged to your knees, and Sigurd himself swings the axe. This brutal ambush tells you everything you need to know about the Orkney Vikings. They didn't conquer the North Sea with honour. They conquered it with math and ruthless pragmatism. While other Vikings sought glory and fair combat, the Earls of Orkney sought only one thing: total domination. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how a tiny island chain produced such dangerous men, you have to ignore modern geography. Don't look at Orkney as a remote vacation spot. Look at it through the eyes of a pirate. Turn the map upside down. For a longship sailing west from Norway, Orkney is the very first landfall. It is the strategic chokehold of the Atlantic. If you control Orkney, you control the Grand Central Station of the Viking Age. You sit right on top of the trade routes to Ireland, the Hebrides and England. The islands provided the perfect natural weapon, Scarpa flow. This massive sheltered harbour could hide 1,000 warships, allowing the Orkney Earls to strike anywhere in Britain and vanish before the smoke cleared. But this fortress wasn't empty when they arrived. It was the home of the Picts. Yet, if you look at a map of Orkney today, the Picts are gone. Not just defeated, but deleted. We call it the silent vanishing. There are no records of the war that destroyed them, but the crime scene evidence is in the DNA. Modern genetic studies of Orkney reveal a terrifying anomaly. While the female lineage has ancient local roots, the indigenous male bloodline was almost 100% wiped out. This suggests a land taking of absolute violence. The Pictish men were slaughtered systematically. The women were taken. The culture was overwritten. In one generation, Pictish stone towers became Viking farmhouses. Pictish art became Viking rubble. From this foundation of genocide and geographical dominance, the Earls of Orkney rose. They were technically servants of the Norwegian king, but in reality they were independent warlords. They built a maritime empire that acted like a rogue state. Sigurd the Mighty, the man who cheated the horse count, was the first great architect of this pirate kingdom. After massacring Maelbrigt's men, he didn't just leave. He decapitated his rival and strapped the severed head to his saddle as a trophy. He rode away cheering, the dead head bouncing against his leg. It was the ultimate display of disrespect. But Sigurd's arrogance blinded him to a simple biological fact. A dead mouth is full of bacteria. As he galloped in triumph, the buck-toothed head of Maelbright swung violently, and that famous tooth scratched Sigurd's calf. The battle was over, but the killing wasn't. The first Earl of Orkney was about to learn that in this brutal new kingdom, even the dead can bite back. The death of Sigurd the Mighty is one of history's darkest jokes. As he rode away from the massacre, the severed head of Maelbrigte bouncing against his leg, the bucktooth scratched his skin. It was nothing more than a graze, but in the 9th century, there were no antibiotics. There was only fate. The bacteria from the dead man's mouth entered Sigurd's bloodstream. Within days, the leg swelled to the size of a tree trunk. The fever took him, and the great conqueror died delirious and rotting from the inside out. He was buried on the banks of the river Oikel. He had won the battle, but the corpse had won the war. Sigurd's death left a terrifying vacuum. The Earls of Orkney were not a stable monarchy. They were a pack of wolves. When the alpha dies, the pack turns on itself. Sigurd's son took over but died childless shortly after, some say of natural causes, others suggest the poison cup was already in fashion. The jarldom reverted to the family in Norway, specifically to the sons of Rognvald, the friend of King Harald Fairhair. This brings us to one of the most unlikely heroes, or perhaps anti-heroes, in Viking history. His name was Einar. He was the youngest son of Rognvald, born to a slave woman. He was described in the sagas as ugly, one-eyed, and utterly unloved by his father. When the chaos in Orkney demanded a new leader, Rognvald looked at his slave son and essentially said, "You go. If you never come back, I won't be sad." Einar sailed west to Orkney not as a prince, but as an exile. He arrived in a land that was treacherous. The wind in Orkney is relentless. It scours the landscape, preventing trees from growing. This was a crisis for a Viking society. Without timber, you cannot build ships. You cannot build halls. Most importantly, you cannot build the hot fires needed to smelt iron or keep from freezing to death in the long winter. Orkney was strategic, yes, but it was also a frozen desert. But Einar had something the other warlords lacked, an engineer's mind. He looked at the boggy, wet ground that everyone else ignored and saw energy. He taught the islanders how to cut the earth itself, digging up the thick compressed layers of peat. He showed them how to dry it and burn it. It seems like a mundane detail, but this was a revolution. Peat burns hot and slow. Suddenly, Orkney had unlimited fuel. This innovation was so defining that history renamed him. He became Torf-Einar, or Turf-Einar. With the energy crisis solved, Einar turned his one eye toward consolidation. He didn't just raid, he governed. But his stability was threatened by the superpower to the east, Norway. King Harald Fairhair had united Norway, but his many sons were violent, entitled princes who roamed the seas causing havoc. Two of these sons, jealous of the Orkney wealth, murdered Einar's father back in Norway and then came for Einar. This leads to a confrontation that defines the brutality of Viking Age Scotland. One of the king's sons, Halfdan Longleg, seized Orkney, forcing Einar to flee to the Scottish mainland. But Einar was playing the long game. He waited for winter, for the storms to isolate the islands, and then he returned with a surprise night attack. He captured Halfdan Longleg alive on the island of North Ronaldsay. Now, imagine the situation. Einar is a bastard earl. Halfdan is the son of the most powerful king in the Viking world. The smart political move is to ransom him. But Einar didn't want money. He wanted to send a message to Norway. Leave us alone. According to the Orkneyinga saga, Einar performed the blood eagle on the king's son. Historians have debated for centuries whether this ritual was real or just literary horror. But the saga describes it with chilling anatomical precision. Einar knelt on his enemy's back, severed the ribs from the spine with a sword, and pulled the lungs out through the wounds, draping them over the shoulders like wings. He offered the prince to Odin, the god of madness and war. Whether literal or metaphorical, the message was received. When King Harald Fairhair heard what happened to his son, he didn't invade with an armada to destroy Einar. He came, saw Einar's defence, and settled for a fine of 60 marks of gold. Einar paid it. He had bought his independence with extreme violence. Under Torf-Einar, the pirate kingdom solidified. They had a sustainable fuel source. They had a fearsome reputation that kept even kings at bay, and they had a new identity. They were no longer just Norwegians abroad. They were Orcadians. They began to intermarry with the local nobility of Scotland, creating a hybrid aristocracy that was part Viking, part Gael. This fusion created a unique political animal. The earls began to play both sides. To the King of Norway they bowed and promised ships. To the King of Scots they bowed and promised protection. In reality they served neither. They were building a commercial empire. The excavated hoards from this period are staggering. We find silver arm rings, roughly chopped up to be used as currency, known as hack silver. This proves Orkney was a cash economy long before the rest of Scotland. But as the wealth grew, so did the stakes. The era of the pioneer earls like Torf-Einar was ending. The era of the politician earls was beginning. The pagan ways were still strong. Odin was still toasted in the great halls, but the shadow of the cross was creeping north. The next great chapter of Orkney would be defined by a clash of faiths, and by a man who would try to hold on to the old gods with a grip of iron. His name was Sigurd the Stout, and unlike Torf-Einar, who built his power on peat and pragmatism, Sigurd would build his on magic. He possessed a totem, a raven banner, woven by his mother with a dark prophecy. It promised victory to the army that flew it, but death to the man who carried it. It was a deal with the devil, and Sigurd was about to sign it. If Torf-Einar was the brains of the operation, his descendant Sigurd Hlodvirsson, better known as Sigurd the Stout, was its muscle and its soul. Sigurd was the archetypal Viking warlord, immense physical strength, a long beard, and a hunger for land that could not be sated. By the late 10th century, he didn't just rule Orkney. He controlled the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and vast chunks of northern Scotland. He was, for all intents and purposes, a king. But Sigurd's power didn't just come from steel, it came from something older. The sagas tell us that Sigurd's mother was not an ordinary woman. She was a daughter of an Irish king, and reputedly a powerful sorceress. When Sigurd was preparing to fight a challenger in Scotland, he went to his mother for advice. She didn't give him a strategy, she gave him a piece of cloth. It was a banner finely woven depicting a black raven, the sacred bird of Odin. The raven was floating on the wind, she told him. I have made this banner for you with all the skill I possess. It carries a specific enchantment. Victory to the man before whom it is born, but death to the man who carries it. Victory for the army, death for the standard bearer. It was a tactical transaction with fate. Sigurd took the banner. In his next battle, the prophecy held true. The Scots were routed, but the man holding the banner was struck dead by an arrow. In the battle after that, the same thing happened. Victory for Sigurd, a grave for the flag bearer. The Raven banner became the most feared and coveted object in the North Sea. It was a symbol of Orkney's dark pact with the old gods. But while Sigurd was winning battles with pagan magic, a new, different kind of power was sailing from the east. Christianity was coming, and it wasn't asking politely. In the year 995, the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason arrived in Orkney. Olaf was a Christian zealot with a sword in one hand and a Bible in the other. He invited Sigurd onto his ship in the harbour of Osmundwall. It was a trap. Surrounded by royal guards, King Olaf gave Sigurd a simple choice. Be baptized, and all your subjects with you, or I will have you killed on the spot, and I will ravage these islands with fire and steel. To ensure Sigurd's compliance, the king seized Sigurd's young son Hundi as a hostage. Sigurd looked at the armada surrounding him, then at his son. He bent the knee. He accepted the baptism water on his forehead, but as the water dripped down his face, the sagas suggest his heart remained stone cold. He converted politically, but spiritually he was still the man with the raven banner. The tension between the White Christ and the Red Thor simmered in his veins until the year 1014. This is the year of the Battle of Clontarf in Dublin, Ireland. It is often called the Twilight of the Gods. It was a massive coalition war. The High King of Ireland, Brian Boru, against a rebel alliance of Dublin Vikings and Sigurd the Stout. Sigurd arrived in Dublin with his fleet, and of course, the Raven Banner. On Good Friday, April 23rd, the armies clashed. It was a slaughterhouse. The descriptions of Clontarf are apocalyptic. Men fought in the surf, drowning in blood and salt water. In the heat of the chaos, the curse of the banner activated. The first man to carry Sigurd's flag was cut down instantly. Sigurd shouted to a second warrior to pick it up. He did, and moments later, he was skewered. Sigurd called to a third man, a warrior named Hrafn the Red. But Hrafn had seen the pattern. He yelled back, "Bear your own devil yourself!" Sigurd the Stout was left alone in the centre of the shield wall. The battle was turning against them. He looked at the flag lying in the mud, the symbol of his mother's magic, the symbol of his pagan identity. He had a choice: retreat and live, or pick up the banner and die. Sigurd ripped the flag from the staff and tucked it into his clothing. He became the standard bearer. Almost immediately a spear pierced him, then a sword. The great Earl of Orkney fell, clutching the raven banner to his chest. His army was defeated. The Irish king Brian Boru also died that day. Clontarf wasn't just a battle, it was the end of an era. With Sigurd's death, the age of the Viking raider in Orkney began to fade. The overt pagan magic died with him on that Irish field, but the Orkney dominance didn't end. It evolved. The sons who followed would not be sorcerers, they would be politicians and kinslayers. The Orkney saga shifts its tone here. We move from the mythic to the Machiavellian. The vacuum left by Sigurd unleashed a brutal civil war between his sons, a Game of Thrones in the freezing mud that would make the Lannisters look like amateurs. It creates the stage for the most complex character in our story. A man who was physically small, dark-haired, and possibly the grandson of a Scottish king. He didn't need a magic flag to win. He had an empire-building mind that would rival Caesar. His name was Thorfinn the Mighty, and he's about to turn the North Sea into his private lake. The death of Sigurd the Stout at Clontarf didn't just kill a man, it shattered the political stability of the North. When a Viking warlord dies, the succession is rarely a handshake, it is a cage fight. And Sigurd left behind a mess that would make the writers of Game of Thrones blush. He left 4 sons. 3 of them, Sumalidi, Brusi and Einar, were full-blooded Norsemen, grown men ready to tear each other apart for a slice of the earldom. But there was a 4th son, a mere boy of 5 years old named Thorfinn. Thorfinn was different. His mother wasn't a Norse woman, she was a Scottish princess, the daughter of King Malcolm II of Scotland. This mixed bloodline changed everything. While his older half-brothers squabbled over the rocky islands of Orkney, little Thorfinn was sent to the Scottish court. He was raised not as a pirate, but as a prince. He learned the art of statecraft from the Scots, while his brothers learned the art of fratricide in the fjords. Back in Orkney, the situation deteriorated fast. The islands were split into thirds, but the brother who rose to dominance was Einar, known as Einar Wry Mouth. History remembers him as a tyrant, a man who taxed the farmers into starvation and enforced his rule with brutal cruelty. The Orkney saga paints a picture of a land living in terror, where a dinner invitation was often a prelude to an execution. To understand the sheer level of dysfunction in this dynasty, we have to look at the atmosphere of the Orkney court. It was a place where family bonds meant nothing compared to power. This is a bloodline where, in later chapters of the saga, we read of the infamous poison shirt. It is a story that defines the Orkney paranoia. The legend tells of 2 noble sisters, Frakok and Helga, who sought to murder their rival, Earl Paul, to clear the path for their own kin. They didn't use a sword, they used a needle and thread. They sewed a magnificent linen shirt, embroidered with gold, but soaked in a lethal toxin. The garment was so beautiful it was irresistible. But in a twist of tragic irony, it wasn't the enemy who found it. It was Helga's own son, Earl Harold. He saw the shirt, admired its beauty, and despite his mother's frantic screaming to put it down, he put it on. The saga describes his death in horrific detail. His flesh began to burn, his body swelled, and he died in agony, killed by his mother's ambition. While that specific tragedy happened a few generations later, the seeds of that madness were sown right here, in the vacuum left by Sigurd. The message was clear. In Orkney, you don't trust your brother, you don't trust your mother, and you certainly don't trust a gift. Einar Wry Mouth was about to learn this lesson the hard way. His tyranny had made him enemies, specifically a powerful chieftain named Thorkel, the foster father of young Thorfinn. Thorkel was the kingmaker of the saga, a man who realised that the only way to survive Einar was to kill him first. The climax came at a feast in Sandwich. Feasts in Viking culture were sacred zones of peace. You broke bread, you didn't break skulls. But the Orkney Vikings had rewritten the rules. Thorkel arrived at Einar's hall with 3 ships. Einar looked at the men and sensed something was wrong, but the laws of hospitality bound him. They sat down to drink. As the ale flowed, Thorkel waited for his moment. The saga describes it with cinematic tension. Einar began to suspect a trap. He turned to his men, perhaps to order an arrest, but Thorkel was faster. He didn't signal a chaotic brawl. He simply stood up, walked over to the Earl's chair as if to whisper in his ear, and buried an axe into Einar Wry Mouth's head. Silence fell over the hall. In any other kingdom this would be treason. But in Orkney, it was politics. Thorkel calmly declared that he had done the islands a favour, and he was right. With Einar dead and the other brother Sumalidi dying of illness, the path was cleared. The board was reset. Brusi, the remaining brother, was a man of peace, described as meek and willing to compromise. He looked at the chaos, looked at the dead Einar, and then looked at the young man returning from Scotland, Thorfinn. Thorfinn was no longer a boy of 5. He was now a young man, backed by the full military might of the King of Scotland. He didn't come to negotiate for a third of the kingdom. He came to take it all. This brings us to the rise of the apex predator. Thorfinn Sigurdsson, Thorfinn the Mighty, was not built like a typical Viking hero. The sagas describe him as uncommonly short, thick-set, with pitch-black hair and sharp, ugly features. He didn't look like a golden-haired Norse god. He looked like a boulder. But inside that rough exterior was a mind sharper than any axe. He possessed a duality that made him dangerous. He had the Viking ferocity of his father, Sigurd, but the political cunning of his Scottish grandfather. He understood that to rule the North Sea, you couldn't just be a raider. You had to be an emperor. Thorfinn bullied his surviving brother Brusi into handing over power. He effectively annexed the islands, uniting them under one iron fist for the first time in decades. But Thorfinn's ambition didn't stop at the shoreline of Orkney. He looked south, to the fragmented clans of Scotland, and saw opportunity. The Game of Thrones was over, the Civil War was done, the winner was the dark-haired boy from the Scottish court, and now he was about to unleash a campaign of expansion that would make his ancestors look like petty thieves. Thorfinn was about to build a domain so large that he would be remembered not just as an earl, but as the Caesar of the North. But to maintain such an empire, you need more than just soldiers. You need an economy, you need a supply chain, and most importantly, you need to understand the sea in a way no one else does. If you walked into a tavern in Orkney in the year 1040, you might see a man sitting in the high seat who looked nothing like a king. The sagas are brutal in their description of Thorfinn Sigurdsson. They call him the Mighty, yes, but they also describe him as uncommonly tall and strong, yet ugly, with a swarthy complexion, sharp features and a massive black beard. He looked like a villain, and if you ask the Scots, he was. But if you ask the history books, he might actually be a character you already know. There is a historical theory that has persisted for centuries, whispering in the margins of academic papers. It suggests that Thorfinn the Mighty might be the inspiration for, or perhaps even the same person as, Shakespeare's Macbeth. Think about it. The historical King Macbeth, or Macbethad, and Earl Thorfinn were contemporaries. They were cousins. They both hated the ruling king of Scotland, Duncan. The Orkney Inga saga tells us that Thorfinn fought a massive war against a Scottish king named Carl Hundason. Historians have scratched their heads over this name for years because Carl Hundason doesn't appear in Scottish records. It translates roughly to peasant son of a dog. It's an insult, not a name. Most modern scholars now agree that this son of a dog was actually King Duncan, so while Shakespeare gave us 3 witches and a floating dagger, the real history gives us Thorfinn. When King Duncan demanded tribute from Orkney's lands in Caithness, Thorfinn didn't send gold, he sent a fleet. The climax of this conflict wasn't a poetic duel in a castle, it was a naval slaughter off the coast of Deerness. Thorfinn, outnumbered, lashed his ships together to form a floating platform of death. He boarded the Scottish king's flagship personally, clearing the deck with an axe. King Duncan, the man Shakespeare portrays as a sweet old grandfather, was forced to flee for his life, only to be killed later. Whether Thorfinn swung the final blow, or his cousin Macbeth did, the result was the same. The Scottish crown was smashed and the north belonged to Orkney. At this moment, Thorfinn became the Caesar of the North. His domain was staggering. We're talking about a man ruling from a small island in the North Sea, who effectively controlled all of the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, huge swathes of Ireland, and, according to the sagas, 9 separate earldoms in Scotland. He controlled more Scottish territory than the King of Scotland did. Under Thorfinn, Orkney ceased to be a pirate outpost. It became an empire. He didn't just raid, he administered. He introduced a legal framework that stabilized the chaotic region. But perhaps the most shocking display of his power wasn't on the battlefield, it was his vacation. In the year 1050, at the height of his power, Thorfinn did something unheard of for a Viking warlord. He stopped fighting. He washed the blood off his hands, packed his bags, and went on a pilgrimage to Rome. Imagine the sight. The ugly giant from the frozen north, walking through the sun-drenched streets of Italy. He met with the Pope. He likely met with the Holy Roman Emperor. This wasn't just a religious trip to ask for forgiveness for all the burning and killing, though he had plenty to apologise for. This was a diplomatic flex. By being received by the Pope, Thorfinn was telling the world, I am not a barbarian. I am a Christian monarch, equal to any king in Europe. He returned to Orkney transformed. The savage warrior became a state builder. He founded the first bishopric in Orkney at Birsay, building a magnificent church known as the Christ Church. He began to separate the church from the state, laying the groundwork for a civilized society that would outlast the Viking raids. It is a rare thing in Viking history, a happy ending. Most heroes like Ragnar or Sigurd die screaming in a snake pit or on a battlefield. Thorfinn the Mighty died in his bed, an old man surrounded by his family and his priests, the undisputed master of his world. But Thorfinn's empire presented a massive logistical problem. How do you feed an army that spans from Dublin to Norway? How do you keep thousands of longships watertight and combat-ready on islands with no trees? The answer lies in the incredible, often overlooked longship economy of Orkney. While Thorfinn was the face of the empire, the backbone was a complex system of taxation, beacons and farming that turned these islands into a military machine. To understand why Orkney worked, we have to look away from the throne room and look at the fields and the fires. To truly respect what Thorfinn the Mighty achieved, you have to look out the window in Orkney today. You will notice something missing: trees. Aside from a few sheltered pockets, the wind in Orkney is too salt-laden and too fierce for forests to grow. This presents a massive historical paradox. The Viking Age was built on wood. Longships are made of oak and pine. Houses were timber. Shields were linden. Charcoal was needed for iron. How does a treeless archipelago become the naval superpower of the North Atlantic? The answer lies in a brilliant, ruthless system of logistics that turned the entire population into a military machine. It was called the Lay Dang, and it was the secret engine of the Orkney Earls. Orkney wasn't just a collection of farms, it was a naval base disguised as a society. The islands were divided into tax districts called ouncelands and pennylands. But the tax wasn't paid in cash, it was paid in crew. Every district was legally obligated to provide a specific number of men, weapons and provisions for the Earl's fleet at the snap of a finger. It was a conscription system so efficient that Thorfinn could mobilise a fleet of huge warships faster than the kings of Scotland could saddle their horses. But what about the ships themselves? Without local forests, the Orkney Vikings became masters of recycling and theft. They relied on driftwood, massive logs from North America carried across the Atlantic by the Gulf Stream, washing up on their beaches. In Orkney, finding a log on the beach was like finding a gold bar. But driftwood wasn't enough. The saga casually mentions that the Earls would sail to Scotland not to raid for gold, but to raid for timber. They would invade the forests of Ross, cut down the trees of their enemies, and sail home to build the ships they would use to invade again. It was a perfect predatory circle. Once the fleet was built, it needed to be protected. The Orkney Vikings invented a surveillance system that predated the telegraph by 1,000 years. If you look at a map of Orkney today, you will see the highest point on almost every island is named Ward Hill. This isn't a coincidence. These were the sites of the beacon fires. The system was simple but terrifyingly fast. A watchman on Fair Isle halfway to Shetland would see a sail on the horizon. He would light his fire. The watchman on North Ronaldsay would see the smoke and light his, then Sanday, then Westray. Within minutes, a signal of enemy approaching would race across 70 miles of ocean, reaching the Earl's Hall before the enemy ship had even lowered its sails. By the time an invader landed, the beaches were already lined with axemen waiting for them. It was the fibre-optic network of the Dark Ages. This constant state of readiness shaped the daily life of every man in Orkney. We often think of Vikings as a full-time profession, but in Orkney it was a seasonal job. The sagas give us a detailed calendar of their year. The Orkney year was a bipolar existence. In the spring, the great earls and their fiercest warriors were on their knees in the mud, sowing barley and oats. They were farmers first. Once the seed was in the ground, the Viking season began. They would launch the spring trip, raiding the Hebrides and Ireland for slaves and silver. They returned in midsummer to harvest the crops, a time of peace and hard labour. Then, once the grain was stored, they launched the autumn trip, a second wave of violence before the winter storms closed the seas. This dual identity, farmer and killer, created a unique culture. These weren't mindless berserkers, they were businessmen. They understood that you needed grain to feed the rowers and silver to pay them. The longship economy was about balance, but as the 11th century ended, this balance began to shift. The connection to the wider world brought wealth, but it also brought a new kind of complexity. The rough-hewn, pagan-influenced world of Thorfinn was giving way to a more European, courtly style. The next generation of earls would not be content with just wooden halls and beacon fires. They wanted stone, they wanted cathedrals, and they wanted sainthood. This desire for spiritual legacy would lead to the most tragic and pivotal moment in Orkney's history. It is a story of two cousins, a holy war, and an execution that would leave a permanent scar on the landscape. The era of the Viking pirate was ending. The era of the Viking saint was about to begin, and it would start with an axe blow to the head of a man praying for his killer. By the early 12th century, the Game of Thrones in Orkney had reached a stalemate. The earldom was once again divided, this time between two cousins who were polar opposites. On one side was Hakon Paulson, a traditional rugged Viking warlord who believed power grew from the edge of a sword. On the other was Magnus Erlendsson, a strange pious man who read psalms while his men raided, and who was rumoured to have once stayed on a ship during a battle, singing hymns while arrows flew around him. Orkney wasn't big enough for both. The islands were on the brink of civil war. The farmers, tired of bleeding for their lords, demanded a settlement. So in the year 1117, the cousins agreed to a peace meeting on the small island of Agilsay. The terms were familiar: strict limits on men and ships. Each earl was to bring only 2 ships. Magnus arrived first with his 2 ships. He was rowing against a calm sea, but as he approached the island, a massive wave struck his boat out of nowhere. The water was calm everywhere else. Magnus looked at the water and said, "This is an omen. My life is ending." The next morning, Magnus watched the horizon. He saw Hakon's fleet approaching, but instead of 2 ships, there were 8. Shields lined the gunwales. It was the 40 horses trick of Sigurd the Mighty all over again, played out 3 centuries later. Betrayal was in the DNA of the Orkney Earls. Magnus didn't run. He didn't rally his men to fight. He went to the small church on the island, prayed, and waited. When Hakon and his soldiers burst in, swords drawn, they expected a battle. Instead, they found a man who had already accepted his fate. The conversation that followed is one of the most remarkable dialogues in Viking literature. Magnus tried to save Hakon from the sin of kinslaying. He offered 3 solutions to spare his own life. First, he offered to go on a pilgrimage to Rome and never return. Hakon refused. Second, he offered to be imprisoned in Scotland for the rest of his life. Hakon refused. Finally, Magnus offered to be maimed, to have his limbs cut off or eyes gouged out, so he would no longer be a threat, but could live in darkness. Hakon, surprisingly, wavered. He was ready to accept the third offer. But the chieftains behind him, the deep state of Orkney, stepped forward. They said, "We will not have 2 earls. One of you must die today." The mob had spoken. Hakon, weak-willed and pressured, nodded. Now came the problem. Who would strike the blow? Killing a praying nobleman in cold blood was bad luck, even for Vikings. Hakon ordered his standard-bearer Ofeg to do it. Ofeg refused flat out. He would fight in battle, but he would not be an executioner. Desperate and angry, Hakon grabbed his cook, a man named Leifolf. Leifolf was not a warrior. He was a servant who made stew. He was terrified. He began to weep uncontrollably, shaking as he held the heavy axe. Then Magnus did something that broke the cycle of violence. He knelt before the weeping cook and comforted him. He said, "Wipe your tears, man. It is not you who does this, but honour demands it. Stand before me and strike me hard on the head. Do not chop at me like a thief. I am an earl, and I should die like one." Magnus prayed for Hakon, prayed for the cook, and bowed his head. Leifolf raised the axe and struck a massive blow to the skull. The saga says he needed a second blow to finish it. Magnus Erlendsson fell dead. Hakon had won. But as with Sigurd the Mighty, the victory was cursed. The island of Egilsay, usually rocky and barren, supposedly grew lush and green at the spot where Magnus fell. Stories of miracles began to spread. The blind regained sight. The sick were healed at his grave. The martyrdom of Magnus became a political firestorm that Hakon couldn't control. Hakon tried to rule, but the ghost of his cousin was louder than his commands. To appease the growing cult of Magnus, Hakon's son and successor, Earl Ragnar II, did something unprecedented. He didn't build a fortress, he built a cathedral. In 1137, the foundation stones were laid for St Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall. It was a masterpiece of red sandstone, a glowing beacon in the grey northern light. But here is the fascinating economic twist. Ragnar didn't pay for it alone. He offered the farmers of Orkney a deal. If they paid for the construction, he would grant them full ownership of their land, abolishing the feudal taxes. The cathedral, therefore, is not just a religious monument. It is a monument to the first crowdfunding campaign in history. It was built by the people, for the people, to honour a man who chose to die rather than start a civil war. When you walk into St Magnus Cathedral today, you're walking into the only medieval cathedral in Britain founded by a Viking. In 1919, during renovations, workers found a loose stone in a pillar. Behind it was a wooden box. Inside was a skull with a clean axe wound, split exactly as the saga described. The bones of the saint were still there, watching over his islands. The death of Magnus marked a turning point. The raw, pagan energy was being channeled into something more sophisticated. The Orkney Vikings were becoming European aristocrats, but they hadn't lost their sense of adventure. In fact, the next Earl would take the Viking spirit on its longest, most ridiculous road trip ever, a crusade to Jerusalem that felt more like a fraternity party than a holy mission. If St Magnus represented the soul of Orkney, his nephew Earl Ragnar Carly Colson represented its swagger. Ragnar was not your typical brooding warlord. He was the Renaissance man of the Viking world before the Renaissance even existed. The sagas tell us he boasted of 9 skills. He could play board games, carve runes, read books, smith metal, ski, shoot, row, play the harp and compose poetry. By the mid-12th century, the raiding lifestyle was becoming old-fashioned. The cool thing to do for European nobility was to go on a crusade. So, in 1151, Ragnar decided to take the boys on a trip. He gathered 15 ships and hundreds of Orkney's finest young warriors and set sail for Jerusalem. But this wasn't a solemn religious pilgrimage. It was a Viking gap year. The Orkney Inga saga describes this journey in hilarious detail. They sailed down the coast of France and Spain, fighting battles, yes, but mostly partying. The highlight of the trip wasn't a siege, it was a flirtation. In the south of France, they stopped at the castle of Narbonne. There, Rognvald met the beautiful Viscountess Ermengarde. Instead of burning her castle, Rognvald fell a little bit in love. He sat in her hall, composed love poems in Old Norse praising her beauty, and she, in turn, invited him to feasts. It is a surreal image, a Viking earl from the frozen edge of Scotland, sitting in the Mediterranean sun, reciting poetry to a French noblewoman. It shows how far the Orkney Vikings had come. They were no longer outsiders looking in. They were players on the world stage. They eventually made it to the Holy Land, swam across the River Jordan as a competitive dare, and visited the holy sites. But on their way back, winter caught them by surprise. They sailed back to Orkney in the middle of a blizzard. Seeking shelter from the storm, they landed near the great stone mound of Maeshowe. Now, Maeshowe is a masterpiece of Neolithic engineering, a tomb built 4,000 years before the Vikings arrived. To Rognvald and his men, it was just a convenient cave. They broke through the roof to get out of the snow and spent several days trapped inside while the storm raged outside. What happens when you lock a bunch of bored, testosterone-filled Viking warriors in a stone room for 3 days? They start drawing on the walls. Today, Maeshowe contains the largest collection of runic inscriptions outside of Scandinavia, but these aren't holy scriptures or deep philosophical thoughts. They are graffiti. They are the 12th century equivalent of tweets or bathroom stall scribbles. One inscription reads, "Thorny Helgi, carved." Another boasts, "These runes were carved by the man most skilled in runes in the Western Ocean." Another simply says, "Inga Girth is the most beautiful of women," which was likely carved by a love-struck teenager. And my personal favourite, a display of pure greed. A great treasure is hidden in the northwest. Archaeologists have checked, there is no treasure. These carvings are incredibly humanising. They strip away the myth of the superhuman Viking. Standing inside Maeshowe today, reading these rude jokes and boasts, you realise these men were just people. They were cold, they were bored, they missed their girlfriends, and they wanted to leave a mark saying, "I was here." But this moment in the tomb was also a metaphor. The Vikings were sheltering in the ruins of the past, while the future was changing the weather outside. When Rognvald finally died, assassinated of course, the golden age of the Orkney Earls died with him. The world was shifting. The kings of Scotland were becoming more powerful, unifying the mainland under a feudal system that had no patience for rogue pirate islands. The kings of Norway were becoming more distant and less interested in protecting their western colonies. Orkney was caught in the drift. The independence that men like Thorfinn and Rognvald had fought for was eroding. The longship economy couldn't compete with the feudal armies of the south. The end of the Orkney Viking age wouldn't come with a bang, or a battle, or a hero dying with a flag in his hand. It would come with a piece of paper. It would come with a wedding dowry that went unpaid. The Lion of the North was about to be sold to the unicorn. The end of the Orkney Viking age didn't come with the roar of a dragon ship. It came with the quiet scratch of a quill on parchment. But before the politicians could sell the islands, nature had to break them. In 1349, a ship drifted into the harbour of Bergen in Norway. Its crew was dead. The cargo was the bubonic plague. The Black Death tore through Norway like a wildfire, killing perhaps 2/3 of the population. The mother country was brought to its knees. The Royal House of Norway effectively collapsed, eventually merging into a union with Denmark. The grip that Oslo held on its western colonies, Orkney, Shetland and the Hebrides, went limp. Orkney was left drifting. The line of the great Norse Earls, the Thorfinn the Mighties, the St Magnuses, eventually died out. They were replaced by the Sinclairs, a Scottish noble family who treated the islands less like a kingdom and more like a piggy bank. But the final blow to independence came in 1468, and it remains one of the most embarrassing real estate deals in history. Enter King Christian I of Denmark and Norway. He was a monarch with a lot of titles but very little cash. He needed to arrange a marriage for his daughter, Margaret, to the young King James III of Scotland. It was a power move to secure peace between the nations. The marriage contract stipulated a massive dowry, 60,000 florins of the Rhine. Christian didn't have 60,000 florins. He checked the treasury, it was empty. So, like a desperate man at a pawn shop, he looked for something to collateralize. He offered the Orkney Islands as a pledge for 50,000 florins, promising to pay the cash later to redeem them. He scraped together the remaining 10,000 florins but came up short again. So, he threw in the Shetland Islands for good measure. The document signed on September 8, 1468, is known as the Impignoration. It is critical to understand. Christian never sold Orkney. He mortgaged it. The agreement was clear. As soon as the Danish king paid the money, Orkney and Shetland would return to Norway. King Christian likely intended to pay it back. But the Scots had other ideas. King James III realised he had just acquired the strategic key to the North Sea for the price of a wedding party. In 1472, Scotland unilaterally annexed the islands. They ignored the right of redemption. Successive Danish kings tried for centuries to buy the islands back. They sent letters, they sent diplomats, they offered gold. The Scots simply ghosted them. For the people of Orkney, this was a catastrophe. They went to sleep as subjects of a distant, benign Scandinavian crown and woke up under the heel of the Scottish feudal system. The difference was brutal. Under the old Norse Udal law, the farmers of Orkney owned their land absolutely. They had no feudal overlord. They didn't pay rent to a master. They paid tax to the king, but the soil was theirs. It was a society of free men. The Scots brought feudal law. Under this system, the king owned everything. The farmers were demoted to tenants on their own ancestral fields. The following century is known in Orkney history as the era of the tyrant earls, specifically the Stuart earls, Robert and Patrick. These men, illegitimate cousins of Mary Queen of Scots, treated Orkney like a slave colony. They forced the free Udal farmers into labour. They seized land using forged documents. They built massive fortified palaces like the Earl's Palace in Kirkwall, using what was essentially slave labour. If you visit that palace today, it is a ruin of stunning beauty, but locals will tell you it was built on blood. Patrick Stewart was so paranoid and despotic that he eventually pushed the islanders too far. He was executed in Edinburgh in 1615, not for oppressing the peasants, though the king didn't care about that, but for treason against the crown. But the damage was done. The Viking Age was over. The Norn language, the melodic Norse dialect spoken by the islanders, began to die out, replaced by Scots. The old laws were eroded, the longships rotted on the beaches, replaced by fishing boats. Yet, despite the legal annexation, despite the language shift, despite the feudal oppression, something survived. The impenuration was never legally reversed. Technically, to this day, there is a legal argument, however thin, that Orkney is still just a pawned item waiting to be redeemed. This unique history created a split identity that persists today. Ask an Orcadian if they are Scottish, and you might get a complicated answer. They are Scottish, yes, but they are something else first. They are the children of the pawned jewels. And as we will see in our conclusion, that Viking ghost isn't just a story for tourists. It is written in the blood, the names, and the very attitude of the people who still live on the edge of the world. If you travel to Orkney today, you might think the Viking age is long dead. You will see modern wind turbines spinning on the hills and cruise ships docking in the harbour. But listen closely. Listen to the way the locals speak. The Orkney dialect is a musical ghost. It doesn't sound like the Scots spoken in Glasgow or Edinburgh. It sings. It rises and falls with a rhythm that linguists can trace directly back to Old Norse. When an Orcadian says bairn for child, or kai for cow, they are using words that would be understood by Sigurd the Mighty. The language didn't die, it just went undercover. Look at the map one last time. Every island name ending in A, Westray, Stronsay, Ronaldsay, is the Old Norse word ai, meaning island. The geography itself is still speaking Norwegian, and then there is the blood. The same DNA study that revealed the silent extinction of the Picts tells us something equally profound about the modern population. A significant percentage of Orkney men today still carry the Y chromosome markers of the Scandinavian west coast. The Orkney Vikings never really left. They just stopped raiding and started farming again. For 500 years, this tiny archipelago punched above its weight. It terrorized kings, burned castles, and shaped the destiny of 3 nations. It produced monsters like Sigurd the Mighty, who killed from beyond the grave, and saints like Magnus, who conquered by dying. The story of the Orkney Vikings challenges everything we think we know about power. We're taught that power comes from the centre, from big cities like London, Paris, or Rome. Orkney teaches us that power comes from connection. By mastering the sea, these islanders turned the edge of the world into the centre of the world. They proved that geography is not destiny, it is opportunity. Today, Orkney is technically a part of Scotland. The pawn ticket from 1468 was never redeemed by the King of Denmark, but in a spiritual sense the redemption happened long ago. The people of Orkney reclaimed their own identity, a fierce, independent spirit that belongs to neither Scotland or Norway, but to the islands themselves. They are the keepers of the St Magnus Cathedral, the guardians of the Neolithic tombs, and the descendants of the pirate earls. The longships are gone, buried under the dunes or rotted by the salt. The axes rust in museums. But stand on the cliffs of Yesnaby when the winter gale hits your face at 60 miles an hour and you will feel it. The ghost of the north is still there, waiting in the wind. The Orkney Vikings didn't disappear, they just became us. If you've enjoyed this journey into the forgotten empire of the North Sea, please take a moment to like this video, it really helps the channel sail further. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next historical deep dive. I have a question for you. Do you think Christian of Denmark should still have the right to buy back Orkney today? Or has history sealed that door forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, keep looking for the history hidden beneath your feet.